Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to implement a user table using the NextUI library. We're going to start from a simple table, then we're going to add pagination, filters, and sorting. So as you can see here, we have pagination. We can filter by a specific name. It filters only the name. And we can also sort once we filtered or even when we're not filtered. So we're going to build on top of a project we have done previously on the channel where we implemented NextUI in our NextJs app. If you haven't watched that video, we implemented this little card component and also talked about different theming options that comes built in with NextUI. You can change the colors, the border radiuses and whatnot. If you haven't seen that video, I'm going to include a link in the card somewhere so you can watch that to understand how you go about bringing NextUI or installing NextUI into your Next.js application. In this video, we're just going to build on top of that one and create a table component for our users to render some users. All I have done on top of that project is to create this users page or segment or route and put a page.tsx inside of it. And as you can see here, this component is responsible for rendering our users. So going back to NextUI documentation, we're going to start from a simple table component, and then we're going to add features like pagination, sorting, and filter as we move on. So let's start by this first simple table here as an example. If you click on the code tab, you'd be able to see the code for this. Let's just copy this, come back to our app, and let's create a component called user table.tsx, and let's just copy paste the code that we have over here. Now, as you can see, the NextUI package exposes different components when it comes to tables for header, for columns, rows, and cells. You're rendering a header here with a bunch of columns and a table body with a bunch of rows, and inside each row we have cells. So let's rename this to our user table, and let's also get rid of this React import. Also, let's use the use client directive because this is a client component. Let's go back to our page and bring in our user table to this page. And let me just get rid of this heading. And now if I go back to my component and refresh, we should be able to see that same simple table. So pretty straightforward. You can use this components exposed from NextUI to shape in simple tables. But oftentimes this data is not like this static, and it will be dynamic. So in the next example, let's actually see how we would deal with dynamic data. So let's fetch some users inside our server component and then pass those users as our data to our table. Now here it says to render tables dynamically, you can pass in the columns prop to your header and the items prop to your table body. So let's see the implementation here. I'm just going to click on the code again, and let's just copy this code and replace this again with our component here. I'm going to explain what we are doing. Let's just rename this to user table first. So here we're pretending that instead of having the rows statically hard-coded inside of the table, we are having these rows and columns, and we're passing this to our table component. So as I mentioned, passing the columns to the table header and then having a render function or render prop here that takes every column. And for each column, it's going to render a table column component from NextUI, and it's going to render the label of that column. Now, our columns here, as you can see, has a key and a label. Okay, we're going to move this columns definition in a second, but from a high level, that's how you would render your columns. Now, similarly for the rows or for your data, we're passing in the items prop to the table body for each item. We're receiving this render prop or receiving the item inside the render prop for each item or row inside of our data. We are rendering a table row, And inside each row, we are getting another render prop, which receives the specific column key. We're going to then use this get key value again from the NextUI library to get the specific cell data from that items object. So from that specific user, let's say, and then we're getting a specific key inside of that user object to then fill in different cells inside of our row. So if I save this and actually set the use client directive up top, the same way that we did for the previous example, and go back to our app, we should again see that same table, but the only difference is that we are actually using these props to pass in our columns and our data. So let's actually make this really dynamic by passing in our user data instead of having to hard code this whatever object or whatever data we have over here. Now, the first thing that I want to do is inside of our users, I want to create this columns component where I can actually export these columns and other useful data for my table inside of this file. So we're exporting that column. Let's actually also define our user's shape. So the user that we're going to be fetching in a second has this shape. There's an ID, name, email, image, and a last seen property. And we have this column definition. First column is name. Second column is going to be, let's say, email. And then the label will be email. And then the last column, maybe we can have the last seen property. And then the label is going to be last seen. Okay, going back here. So let's just export these columns. And now for the rows, let's actually fetch some data server side and then pass that data to our user table. Let me close this off so we have more room. Let me paste in a function that allows me to fetch some users. I have a typo here, so let's rename this column to columns. Yes, let's also update the import. Now I have defined this get users function, which returns a promise that resolves into an array of users. We are hitting this mock API endpoint, which is just going to give us back some users, and we're returning the users. So from here inside of our app, we can say users, and now we can await this get users function we created to get some users. Again, we are inside of our server component, so we can turn our component or page component into an async function. Therefore, we can await or do the data fetching right inside of our server component. Now, before I go ahead, let's just open up this mock API site. I've talked about it before, but it's mockapi.io. You can create different projects and different endpoints. Inside of each one, you can define shapes or schemas for the resources that you want to fetch. You can also connect different connected resources. So for example, users and to-dos, and then it exposes an API endpoint for you to just fetch them inside of your app when you are testing or during development. Coming back to our application. So all we did is to fetch some users here. Now let's pass this users down to our user table. So we're going to expect a users prop here. So let's go to our users table and actually expect this props of users. I can also type this to be users, and this is going to be again an array of user. Okay, now that we have this users, this is going to be our data. So instead of passing in this rows, I can pass in my users here and say for each item, I'm going to access item.id because my user has an ID, and then pass that item and the column key to this get key value to render each cell. Now on the right hand side, as you can see, it populated my table because I have already defined my columns to be name, email, and last seen. This is coming from our definition of columns. And then inside of our user table, we basically are mapping over our data for each user object. We are creating a row. Inside of each row, we are creating different cells by calling this get key value function that provides the user object and that specific column key, which maps to this column keys here to render that specific cell's data. So now this table is no longer using this static data. It's just dynamically fetching data inside of our React Server component, passing it down to our user table, which is a client component, and we're rendering that dynamically here. So let's go back to the documentation and move to the next step. Now, one thing I want to mention is this little note that they have here. You may wonder, if you have an array of users, why are we not mapping as we usually do in React components to render each row? And it's explaining that for React Aria to be able to actually render these items inside your table efficiently, it's better to use this items prop, and React Aria is going to cache this data or list items. So therefore, it's not going to re-render every item when they change. This is a performance optimization technique rather than using the array.map. Now, when we are dealing with empty state, so when we don't have any users, we can actually pass in a prop to our table body, as you can see, empty content, and say if there was nothing here, just render this. So if I go to table body and actually paste this in here to say no rows or no users to display, if I go back inside of my page component now and pass in an empty array, coming back to our page and refreshing, we see this no user to display. Pretty straightforward. Now, without header is if you don't want to have a header. Without wrapper is without that wrapper that we can see around the table. And now next, let's talk about custom cells. So instead of just rendering the username, it's showing the name, the avatar, and also the email in one cell. And then there's different things you can do for each cell. Let's now see how we would go about implementing this. Now here in the code example, what they've done is they've created this render cell function where it gets the user object and the specific column key that we are on, and it's going to use a switch statement, or it's going to check to see what the column key is, and depending on the key, it's going to return a component to be rendered inside of our cell. Now inside of our table, instead of calling the get key value, we're calling this render cell, passing in the item or the user object and the specific column key. Now I would like to take this function out of this component or the table component and actually put it inside of our columns where we're defining our user table object. So let's actually copy some code, and I'm going to explain what I'm doing here. We'd also need some icons, so let me just quickly copy these icons as well. So we have this icons component that's basically exporting a couple of different icons. As you can see, we're going to use them inside of here. So let's actually see what we're doing. So I'm creating that same render cell function that we just saw on the docs, which is going to get the user object and the column key. We're going to get the cell value by accessing the user object at that specific key. And then we're switching on the column key. If it's the name, we're going to render a user component. This is also from NextUI. If I go back here, let me just make this a smaller. On the left-hand side, you can actually see different components from NextUI. Now down in the bottom, there's this user component, which basically is a combination of the user avatar, the name, and a description that you can pass in there. So for the avatar, I'm using the image key or property on the user object. For the description, I'm using the email. For the name, I'm using this cell value because remember, we're on the key of name. So this is going to be the name of our user. Now, before going to the next key, I also want to mention that I have changed the column definition. So before we had the name, the email, and the last seen. Now here, because I'm already showing the email inside of this name column, so I've removed that email column on its own. I put this last seen, and then at the end, we're going to create this actions column where you can have different buttons to edit the user, to view the user, or to delete the user. So the next column or the next key I'm looking up is the last seen. If that's the cell we are rendering, I want to get the cell value, turn it into a new date, and then change it to the local date string, which is a better representation of our date. And inside of our actions column, this is a column that's not actually using the cell value. It's just rendering some tooltips, but you can actually also access the cell or the specific user object here to then perform any action that you want, for example, editing or deleting the user. So going back inside of our table, now instead of calling this get value, let's actually call our render cell that we just created that is going to now return some custom cells for us. So let's go back to our application. If I go back to the page and replace this empty array with our users and save. Now, as you can see, we have changed how our table looks. We've customized the name column to actually show a user component with the avatar, name, and email. We're also formatting this date into a local string, and we added this actions column where you can actually perform different actions on this specific user. Now we're fetching 100 users and all of them are showing on the same page. So next, let's actually implement pagination. Let's go to the table tab. And here, let's search for pagination. Let me close this off. So let's look at paginating our table. So again, let's look at the code here. So what they've done is they are creating a local state to store what page we're currently on. And then we're getting the length of our users or the total number of our users divided by how many users per page we want to show, to actually come up with our total page number. We then are going to actually slice our users array with a start and end that we're calculating depending on the page. So whatever page we're on, this is how you would calculate the starting and ending index of your users. So page -1 times the number of users per page. And then at the end, it would be your start plus the number of users per page. And anytime our page changes, we're going to actually reslice our users array to then show that specific number of users. Now down here in the table, what they had done is also included this bottom content on the table component where you can pass in an actual component. They are using this pagination component from NextUI. So again, if you look at this pagination, you can see that they have this pagination component with different options that you can use. So going back here, let's actually implement this together. So inside of our user table, what we want to do is actually bring in this piece of state. So let's copy this inside of our component. We're going to need the user state. So let's import this from React. Let me also remove this and bring in use memo. Now the use memo is not very useful when we are just using it on its own here, but later on when we are actually implementing sorting and filter, we're going to use the value of these items inside the dependency arrays of other functions. That's why we're memoizing this function to not recreate it or to not cause a re-render in other functions. So let's just save this up. The other thing that we need to bring in, as I mentioned, is this specific component that we have for the bottom of our table. So let me just copy this, go inside of our table. Let's actually make this on 2 lines. And then let's copy this. Let's also bring in the pagination component and save this up. So what we're doing is passing in a pagination component. These are some options you can pass in. You can look through the pagination component docs to see what options you can pass in. But basically we are passing in the page. This is our page state. We are passing in the onChange to set that page, and the total number of pages is this math.ceil that we calculated off top here. Now instead of passing in our users to this rows, we want to use this paginated items or the sliced array. So here inside of my table body, instead of passing in the users, I'm going to pass in the items. So let me just save this and go to our component. As you can see, we have a paginated table that's currently showing 4 users per row. Now, this is something you can change, so you can maybe have 5 users per row or 8 users or whatever amount of users that you want. It comes with buttons to go or move back and forth or to a specific page number. Now, another thing you can do here, if you want this pagination to be outside of your table, you can pass in the bottom component placement, and you can pass in outside, which is going to make this pagination to go outside of your table if you prefer that. So as you can see, it was pretty straightforward to render your tables dynamically with the data that we fetched inside of our server component. We defined our columns and specifically what goes into each cell with the render cell function we created and added pagination to it. Now, going back to the documentation, there's more you can do with the table component in terms of pagination or filtering and sorting. For example, this async pagination, where you're actually loading data inside of your client component, and that's an asynchronous task, so it takes time. So you're actually performing or showing a loading state there. In our example, we are fetching all of our users inside of server component and passing that to our client component, and literally just paginating in inside our users on the client side. Now, also, you can see there's infinite pagination. This is like an infinite scroll, so you can get to the bottom of the table and load more. It's using the use async list hook from the React stately. You can look through this if this is a specific use case for you or something you want to implement. Now, what I want to do is to actually enhance our user table by adding this filter option, so we can filter by name, and also the ability to sort by name. So let me just copy some code over here, and I'm going to explain what I'm doing here. So let's see what I've added to our user table component here. The first thing I've added is this filter value state, where we're going to hook this up with this input. So let me just go back to our application. Now, as you can see, this is showing up that input. We're going to hook this up with our own local state. I'm checking to see if I do have a search filter by passing this filter value into a Boolean function or the Boolean constructor to know whether or not I actually have a search term. And then once I do have a search term, all we're doing here is to get our users array and filter it based on user objects that actually contain this filter value inside of the user name. And we're returning this filtered user. So that's the first thing that we're doing. Again, we're using this use memo function because we're using these filtered items to actually calculate other arrays, and we want to memorize this and change it anytime that this specific values are changing. Now for the pagination is the same thing that we had before. We have the page number we're currently on, the number of rows per page we want to have, the total number of pages, and depending on this, we are selecting or calculating and start and end point for our array, and we're just slicing this time. Instead of the user object, we're slicing the filtered items. Now down here, I've also included the state for our sort descriptor. This is going to tell us what column we want to sort based on and what the direction for that sorting is, whether ascending or descending. Now inside of this function, we are getting our items. This is the items that we got out of our pagination. We are sorting through them, and we're actually creating this comparison where we're actually looking up to the column on the sort descriptor. So this is going to be passed to us from the table component. Once you click on a specific field, if it is sortable, the table component is going to invoke this function and it's going to change this state. So therefore, we are actually going to that column. So we know which value inside of our user object we're actually comparing. In this case, we're just doing the name, but it can be any other sortable column. Next thing I have added here is this on search change. This is going to be invoked whenever the user is actually typing inside of this input, which is just going to set this local state and bring the page back to 1. And if it's an empty value, it's going to set the filter to an empty string. On clear, similarly, when you start typing here, is this when you're clicking on this X to clear this input, is going to set the filter to an empty string and bring the page back to 1. Now, last thing before actually getting to our table component is this top content. So similar to where we passed in this bottom pagination or bottom content for our table, you can also pass in a top content. Inside of our top content, we are rendering this input element. Again, input is from NextUI component, and we're passing in this on search, this functions we created here to this input, and on clear also to this. So it is actually hooked up with these two components. The value is also set to our local state. So this is now working in sync with our local state, updating it, and we're actually using these values to filter our users based on their name. So down inside our table component, we have this top content similar to the bottom content. So we have put it into this top content component we created up above. And again, the placement is outside. The bottom content is the pagination we've added before, and it is also outside of our table. Now the sort descriptor is the local state we created, and the set sort descriptor is when the sort actually changes. This is when the user clicks on a specific sortable column to either select that column to be sorted or clicks again to change the direction of the sorting. Now down here, if you want to make a column sortable, you have to pass in this allow sorting prop to your column. Now what I'm doing here is I'm looking to see only if I'm inside the column name, I'm passing allow sorting prop true. So all the other fields are not sortable for me. I'm only sorting based on the name. Now you can also make other fields sortable by just passing this allow sorting to all of your columns. I wanted it to show how you would go about just making one specific column sortable. Now everything else is pretty much the same. We are calling this render cell function to get the specific value or the component that we want to render in each cell. Now let's quickly review what we have done here one more time. We created some local states specifically for the filter value. This is whatever the user is typing in here. Depending on that, we filtered our users array, depending on the users that have that specific term in their names. We then ran them through the pagination. So we were looking to see what page we are on, and then we sliced that filter array based on the number of users that we want to show on that specific page. And then we included a state for our sorting, what column we're on and what direction it has. And then we got our filtered value, ran through this sorting to get some sorted items, and we passed these sorted items down to our table instead of all the users. Now we also had these functions that are going to call this local states when the search changes or when the user actually clears the search. The two components that we had for the top part, including this input, and the bottom component, which was this pagination. And that's a wrap for this video, folks. We implemented a dynamic table in NextJs using the NextUI library. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. Other than that, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.